Good morning, Prague. I'll reiterate Reese's comment, wow, what a crowd. I'm sure you're all sat in your hotel rooms working the hangover off, watching the live stream. That's cool. Gives my voice a bit of room to echo, which is nice. So yes, hello, my name is Paul Graham-Raven. I am a researcher in sustainability transitions and infrastructure futures. I'm also a practicing critical futurist, and I'm an author and critic of science fiction. My core expertise, and as much as I have one, is understanding how the stories we tell about futures shape the lives we end up living. Now, it's in some ways very difficult and challenging to follow Rees, actually, because he's talked about a lot of the same stuff that I'm going to talk about, and he's like a proper lecturer, right? I've spent 12 years in the academy. I can't do that well. I do a different thing. I guess one way of saying it might be that Rees has been the good cop. I'm afraid I'm going to be the bad cop today. That is a role I take on very grudgingly. I don't want to have to do this, but that's just the way it is. I'll be honest, it's a bit of fun. So I am likewise going to talk about solarpunk, solarity, as it's sometimes referred to in the academic literature. And particularly, I want to talk about solarpunk as utopia. Now, Rees talked about this to some extent. I'm going to take a slightly different, it's the same theory, but I'm going to take a different angle on it because I want to use it as a bit of a heuristic for thinking about different forms of utopia, or ways almost sort of categorizing them, if you like. So, and as Rees pointed out, utopias are kind of like the earliest form of futurism, right? It's a form of storytelling about futurity. It kind of emerges after the Middle Ages. It replaces the eschatology of the Christian mindset in the Middle Ages in Europe. And it fundamentally recognizes that human action and choices can affect the form of life in times to come. So the term utopia is worth thinking about before we start, because it has a double meaning. Okay, so it's based on not just one, but two Greek words, which said in Greek means something slightly different, because Greek is a more sort of a tonal language, where a slight change in tone changes the meaning of the word. But English doesn't work that way. So if we say utopia, there's only really one way to pronounce it. But in Greek, there are two slightly different ways of pronouncing it. And one of them comes out as, I suppose, if you overemphasize the pronunciation, so utopia, is not place or no place, non-place, if you like, whereas utopia means good place. And Sir Thomas More, who wrote the original book from which the word utopia comes, was very much, it's debated whether he was doing it deliberately or not, but he's very much kind of playing on that tension between imagining a good place, but also imagining a place that is not a place, right? It's non-existent, but it's also not here, whether in space or in time. This tension is in all utopian narratives, which are plentiful, as Rees has pointed out. So there are, and this is a simplification, but we can think of there being three different forms or modes of utopian narrative, right? Those three modes are the classic, or what I call the constitutional utopia, the technological utopia, and the critical utopia. And we'll look at those very, very briefly. So the classic utopian form starts with Thomas More's Utopia. Arguably, scholars debate this, scholars debate everything, that's what scholars do. What's really important for this argument is to bear in mind that the classic utopia is always a blank slate, right? It leans very hard into the non-place thing. By definition and by practice, to write about a complete rewriting of the way society works, you have to imagine a space where the existing society is not. You need a blank slate, you need an open field in which to build that new idea. You've got to go somewhere that is unknown in order to do things differently. Now, I call the classical form the constitutional form because one way of describing how the classical utopia works is it posits a society which has been perfected through what we would now describe as policy making. A bit of law in there as well, that's why constitutional, but fundamentally, policy, decisions made in how things are run. It's a form of top-down social change, which if you think back to the fact that this was created in a time of kings, this is before democracy, right? It makes sense. Change happens from the top down. And technology, not really, technology was a thing, but it didn't mean what technology means to us now, which is a complex thing, as, again, Rees has pointed out. But one way of really sort of nailing down what the constitutional utopia is about is it's kind of defined by an idealism, right? It's not, it's about clearing the space and saying, right, let's build from the top down an entire new way of doing society, but through social relations first and foremost. So then you have the technological utopia. Now, this again is very sort of contended by scholars, but I tend to say that technological utopia starts in the late 19th century. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, you get that first emergence of the technological as a force in history. Alessandro talked about this very lucidly yesterday. It becomes a popular and proletarian genre through American pulp science fiction in the post-war era, and so there is that sense that the technological utopia is actually enabled by technologies which enable the cheap production and distribution of story as well. And the technological utopia fundamentally rejects the possibility of perfection that is inherent in the classical utopia, right? The classical utopia says we're going to make a perfect society by designing it from the top down as a new set of social relations. Technological utopia says, no, I don't like the sound of that. I'm not convinced we can perfect things. I'm too rational to believe that. It's a very rationalist genre. Rejects the possibility of perfection. And it's also deeply suspicious, indeed, of political routes to betterment, right? The technological utopia wants to improve society, but it's not really convinced that politics can do it, and actually is often quite hostile to the idea that politics can do it. If you think a lot of the classic 50s science fiction, the example I tend to go to is Robert Heinlein's The Roads Must Run. It's basically a short story about union busting, but it's also a short story about how we can improve the city through basically escalators that are pavements. It's a classic of the time. I don't think much of it myself. So the classic utopia is, drama. You okay, man? Okay. Yeah. So if the classic utopia is defined by idealism, the technological utopia is defined by optimism, the optimistic assumption that advances in technology can fix social problems. Rees unpacked this brilliantly in the previous talk. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch it. It's far more lucid and interesting than I could have made it. I'm just trying to skip through here. But the point is that the technology utopia is fundamentally triumphalist, capitalist, and solutionist. Now, the critical utopia it's kind of if you know your dialectics, it's kind of the synthesis of the previous two, right? It comes out of the new wave science fiction of the late 70s, which was in turn a response to the failure of the hippie dream of the late 60s. The hippie dream can be thought of as a kind of attempt to do classical utopia in opposition to the technological utopia of the post-war period. That fails. There's a realization, okay, that model isn't going to work again. It didn't work the first time either. We need to try something else. The critical utopia rejects both the top-down perfection of the classical utopia and the solutionist anti-politics of the technological utopia. And I think I make the point there. One way of defining it, and I'm flagrantly quoting my own papers here because that's just a thing you've got to do sometimes. The critical utopia concerns the depiction of a utopian project in the process of undergoing its inevitable failure, even as it sustains the critique of the status quo implied by all utopian modes. So, and again, just poking at another thing Rees said and unpacking it a little bit further. So, in utopian scholarship, we make a distinction between optimism and hope. Now, the words are less important than the meanings, because it turns out that in different languages, people use the same words in the opposite ways. What's important is the distinction in meaning. And I go to a great writer called Rebecca Solnit on this, who, if you're interested in solarpunk and environmental issues, read Rebecca Solnit. She's really, really good. She's an amazing writer, great human being. The Solnit distinction is that optimism is the assumption that basically everything will work out fine. It's like stuff is bad, yeah, but it'll get fixed. The thing with optimism is fundamentally passive, right? It's sort of like, yeah, it'll be fine. That will get fixed, but by someone. The passive voice is being used, right? It will be fixed. Who will do the fixing or what will do the fixing? It's not really in there. It's all right, it's not my problem. It'll be fine. Hope is a different thing. Because with hope, there is the assumption that, yes, things could be better, but only if we work for it, and always against the inevitable encroachment of entropy, of difficulty, of things going wrong. So how does solarpunk score as a utopia in terms of those three modes? So it's still a young genre. It's much more popular and successful as an aesthetic or vibe, as a sort of an image-making system. It's fiction written under the badge of solarpunk, at the risk of being very, very sweeping, is mostly not very good. And that's actually because of exactly what Rees was talking about, right? The problem with solarpunk is it has this glorious vision, but it articulates the future that we want, but it does not connect us to it. It does not articulate in that sense, right? It's very good. That's where we want to go, but how do we get there? That question is very, very hard, because solarpunk writers tend to be optimistic. They want it to be a comforting alternative literature to cyberpunk. And so there's this kind of we don't want to talk about it's we want to be optimistic. It's going to happen, it's great. That question of how we get there, I just want to write stories set in the nice city with all the trees on the buildings. And I get it, it's nice. Now, successful solarpunk utopias in literature tend to be non-places, not in the sense that they're because there are no places left to colonize in the world, or at least there are very few. It's very hard to imagine a blank slate where you can just build a new civilization. But they tend to be non-places in time, right? One of the tricks of science fiction is to displace in time rather than space. So, well, this non-place is in the future rather than over there in South America. So, in that sense, it has elements of the classic utopia. And sometimes, it's also set in places where, the implicit thing with solarpunk is it's set in a place where putting some solar panels and windmills and everything has basically fixed the environmental problem, right? So it's, it's an optimistic tech utopia. We throw tech at the problem solved. There is a bit of reflexivity in there. There is a bit of understanding. I've been talking to some people over the last day and a half, and there is some understanding that maybe it won't be that simple. But not really as much as there could be, right? There is this real shying away in a lot of solarpunk from the question of the process, right? It articulates the vision, but it does not articulate the route there. So, is solarpunk then a future we want? It's a nice dream, as Rees said, right? It's inspiring, it's seductive. I look at those pictures and I'm like, shit, yeah, I want to live there, that'd be great. But the question of how we get there tends to be skipped over, right? It tends to be reduced to, actually in a lot of the stories that actually kind of work as stories, most of the way the place that's being written about got to be a solarpunk utopia is basically everywhere else basically burnt down, and these smart, sensible people have built a little enclave where it all kind of worked out. Again, the important questions are largely avoided, right? How did it happen? How does this utopia get built? Where does it happen? For whom does it happen? And what does it cost? So I want to think about blockchain, Ethereum, whatever we're calling it, in the same way. Okay, let's think about the blockchain as a utopian narrative. Now, I think the reason I've been invited here is because blockchain has been suggested as one way towards to articulate that solarpunk future. How viable is that? Is the question I'm trying to ask. Rees has already shown the similarities between this, as some of what I'm doing is kind of repeating and building on what he's done there. One way to put this in the language of programmers, I suppose, is, as I said earlier, Rees has been the good cop, I'm your bad cop today. To put this in programmer language, right, I am your ethical pen tester, right? I am your ideological red team. I'm your adversarial analysis, okay? I'm going to go hard here. I'm not going to apologize for that. However, I am going to be as generous as I'm able. I want to strongman this argument, okay? I want to give Ethereum, the blockchain, the best chance it has to stand up. But this is going to be a critique, okay? And I'm not going to go easy, sorry. I do need some water, though. There we go. Okay, so we've considered solarpunk as a utopian narrative. Let's do the same for the blockchain. Now, we can skip over this quite quickly because Rees has done a lot of the work for me, which is great. So it's really, really hard to deny A lot of heroic claims are being made for blockchain just at this conference, right? This is all stuff I got from the conference schedule. So some of these, permissionless market creation, create a better world, reduce inequality, universal access to all knowledge, unlock energy flexibility, which will be secure and transparent, mind you, accelerate net zero, bootstrapping impact markets, still not sure what that means, smart cities, which you'll note I have tagged as the zombie utopia, because it just won't fucking die. Smart cities, it just will not die. Web3 marketplaces offer evolution above the status quo. Again, evolution of what? Not sure. Closing the justice gap. Okay, and what I want to be really clear about is I'm trying to strongman this argument, and I believe in the sincerity of the people making these claims, right? This is important. I trust that the people saying they think it can do this really believe it can. I genuinely believe that. But I'm still going to try and tell you why you're wrong. So, blockchain is utopian form. The obvious one to start with is the technological utopian form, right? It's really undeniable. Rees has made the case. Total optimism in technological solutions as a way of articulating the future, coupled with a deep distrust of old forms of political action and the state. Okay, no doubt about that at all. There are elements of the classic utopia in there as well. I'm thinking about those DAOs which were kind of like, yeah, we'll just buy some land and start a city. And that's worked out well, hasn't it? But also the whole coder's law thing, right? And as someone who was like writing on the internet in the mid-noughties, I don't think when Lessing talked about coder's law, I don't think he meant it as a good thing. I think it's worth going back to that and taking another look. But, so the coder's law thing is a constitutional structural reordering, right? Coder's law is very much that kind of, blank slate. We'll just rewrite a whole new set of laws. These old ones aren't working. Let's start from scratch. What could possibly go wrong? And there's the placelessness of internet discourse as well, right? It's where are we going to do it? Oh, everywhere, anywhere. And it's like, no, you have to do stuff in the world because the world is not the same everywhere. Is it a critical utopia? Well, I could make a joke about the whole ongoing inevitable failure thing. I'm not going to do that. But there isn't a lot of reflexivity or internal critique in this space. The fact that you've had to import me to do this ideological red teaming thing is an indication that maybe you haven't got enough sort of native reflexivity in this scene, right? If there was, I wouldn't be here. I'm very glad to be here. I'm having a nice time. But nonetheless, you should be doing this for yourselves, right? But so what, right? What's your problem, Paul? Blockchain may be undeniably utopian. So what? This isn't a sci-fi story, Paul. This is a revolutionary economic technology. Don't judge it as a story. That's just unfair. We've invented an amazing thing here. Don't judge it that way. So okay, let's park the utopian thing. We'll come back to it later. And let's move down a level, and let's think about those economic promises, because there's a sort of more detailed narrative down here, isn't there? What claims are made for the blockchain, and how do they match the evidence? So the main claims, as far as I can tell, because wading through all the stuff that's been written about the blockchain is, I don't have the time. I have like a day job to do and stuff, but I've tried to read a bit around. And the big deal, as far as I can tell, is perfect, efficient free markets, right? This is the economic dream, right? We will make the perfect, efficient markets. And those markets will be decentralized and non-hierarchical and implicitly free of state interference. So, again, pretty utopian, but we're leaving that aside. But how do those promises stand up on their own terms, is what I want to ask now. And does it match up with the whole justice and environmental ideas of the solarpunk vision that it's trying to be married to? So, all but the most crazy economists would admit that the perfect market is like a perfect circle. You can describe it in theory, but it's impossible to make one in the real world. There's no time to go into great detail about the different meanings of freedom, but we can talk briefly about the distinction between freedom to and freedom from. And the point I'm going to make here is that both of those are good things, but they are meaningless in the absence of the other one. Okay, if you have pure freedom to, which as an outsider looking in, is how a lot of this blockchain stuff seems to work. It's like, yeah, you've got the freedom to transact with whoever you like, which also means you have the freedom to screw anyone over you like, and you have the freedom to get out of there with your identity concealed and suffer no consequences for it. Whereas freedom from is, the freedom to not have people do that to you, right? And it's great to have freedom too when you're the person who comes out all right, who leaves Tornado Cash with all the Ethereum in your back pocket. It's not very nice to be the little guy who got screwed over by it. Okay? It sounds great on paper, but in practice, it looks like the Wild West, and that's kind of appealing, right? I like cowboy movies. I don't know if many people in the Ethereum scene have ever watched the series Deadwood. You really, really should watch Deadwood. Partly because it's great TV, but partly because it has a lot to say about the way this world works. Okay, and there's an important lesson in there. There's the old joke about a gold rush, right? Do you know how you make money in a gold rush? You sell shovels. You don't mine gold, you sell shovels. Has anyone been looking at NVIDIA's stock price recently? Just going to throw that one out there for you. But okay, let's leave that aside. Maybe that can get fixed. I'm sure it can. Code is law, right? We can fix that. It's not a problem. We'll fix that. So efficiency, efficient markets, that's what we want, right? Efficient markets will make everything better. What could be wrong about efficiency? The economic argument for free markets hinges on efficiency, and in a sense, that argument is actually true. But the sense in which it's true is very particular, and it turns out that efficient markets tend very strongly not to decentralization, but actually to monopoly. So economics is a very weird discipline for lots of reasons. If you want an example, Google the term spherical cows, or Homo economicus would be another one. All disciplines, all fields, all communities of discourse use words in a special and particular way. And it's always worth checking those particular meanings when those communities start making big claims about what they can do. So, free markets are efficient. What does that actually mean? Maybe someone here would like to give me the vernacular definition of efficiency, right? If I said to you, oh, my car's very efficient, what would you think I was saying? Would someone like to step in? What about you, sir? Well, if I said my car is efficient, what would you think I was saying about my car?
Using less gas than other cars.
Using less gas. Yes, that's right. And that's, I think, generally, when we hear someone talk about efficiency, that's generally what we think. So I went to the dictionary, and the Oxford English Dictionary says, efficient means effective, adequately operative, right? There is definitely this implication that an efficient thing uses as little of something as necessary to get the job done. This is almost completely opposite to what an economist or an investor thinks efficiency means. What an economist or investment person thinks efficiency means, and I'm just going to read this out from Investopedia. Economic efficiency is when every scarce resource in an economy is used and distributed among producers and consumers in a way that produces the most economic output, which is to say profit, and benefit to consumers. Every scarce resource. Every scarce resource. So, an efficient process or market in the economic sense uses everything. Anything left unused, anything not profited from, that's inefficient. Now, using all the stuff doesn't sound very sustainable, right? But that's the unspoken rule of the game, efficient markets. But okay, let's assume that's, but that's not what we mean. We mean the other sort of efficiency. The frugal efficiency. But you get another problem there, because even when it's the other sort of efficiency, you get the same problem in a different way. There's an economic idea, actually from the 1800s, I think, originally. A guy called Jevons came up with the Jevons paradox, which describes the way in which greater efficiency leads to cheaper inputs, which works as a market signal for ever more production. Okay? If something gets cheap, and you're in an efficient market, people will just use the stuff that doesn't need to be used because it's just like cheap. It's crazy. You can't leave it there. Be inefficient. Use it up. And this applies to clean energy too, right? You can think about the cost of something, not just in terms of its cash cost, but in terms of its emissions cost, right? So if we make energy production cleaner, the cost in terms of emissions goes down, and so more uses are found for energy, which demands more energy production. Production doesn't take place on a piece of paper. It takes place in a world where resources and customers are unevenly distributed. That's why we invented logistics, right? But logistics adds to the imperative to centralize, because it's more efficient, right? One of the examples I use here a lot is milk production. Like before refrigeration and trucks, most milk herds were just little herds of cows on the outside of the town. And the milk guy would put some milk in a churn that he couldn't refrigerate, and he'd take it into town, and he'd put each churn in a shop, and they'd just ladle out the amount of milk he wanted, fresh on the same day. But as things get, the city grows and the farms move outside, and you start being able to truck and refrigerate stuff. And at that point, it's like, well, I'm in competition with that other farm, and if I can save money by producing more stuff and trucking it from further away and refrigerating it for longer and mixing together milk from multiple sources, this is how we end up with huge, 10,000 cow dairy farms in the middle of fucking nowhere that produce loads and loads of methane emissions, right? Hugely intensified production in one particular location. The absolute opposite of decentralization. And logistics itself tends to monopoly for exactly the same reason, which is why Jeff Bezos is, I think at the moment, not quite the richest man on earth, but very, very close, right? Those free markets are working pretty good for Jeff. This isn't how it's supposed to work, Paul. We're going to fix all this. Coda's law will fix it. This is exactly what we're trying to get away from. This isn't how it's supposed to work. Well, actually it is. This is actually the core of what we call, what we sometimes controversially call neoliberalism, right? Which is the economic water in which everyone in this room has been swimming for the last 40 years. Free markets and decentralization stem from a deeply incompatible, there's a paradox here that is not resolvable. And this radical new economics that the blockchain promises starts to look actually a lot more like the same old economics that is worried about losing its job, especially as all of a sudden protectionism is back in fashion. Bloody states, right? They spoil everyone's fun. But it does seem there is some fandom actually for centralization in the blockchain world. Here is your friend and mine, Peter Thiel, rather boldly riffing on Tolstoy in an essay with the blunt title of "Competition is for Losers." And it sounds there like he's pretty keen on centralization, actually. Monopoly sounding pretty good to Peter. And let's also think about Sam Altman, right, who is busily saying to the US government, oh, please regulate us, because I can afford to comply with regulation and my competitors cannot. Build me a moat, Mr. Biden. Okay. So let's assume that the biggest names in blockchain don't represent what it's actually about. Let's assume that somehow the software will fix the paradox of free markets and monopoly formation. There is another problem we need to talk about, and that is the issue of infrastructure. How am I doing for time? Okay. So all those problems I've just talked about, it's fine. Fixed all that. That's fixable. We'll assume that for now. You've still got another problem. Now, infrastructure is a big and, like every scholarly term, kind of contested, means different things to different people. I am I literally call what I'm interested in concrete infrastructure. The pun is deliberately intended. I am talking about like pipes, pylons, roads, railways, that sort of real sort of heavy infrastructure. Now I know that, the first meaning of coders, when coders hear infrastructure, they think, oh, no, I know what infrastructure is. Flops, right? Computation. We're going to build a blockchain future, we're going to need a whole lot of computers. I live in Sweden. There's a lot of these getting built in Sweden. Do you know why? Because the energy is really cheap in the north of Sweden, because there's lots of hydroelectric power, and because it's cooler, so you don't have to cool the data centers quite so much. But again, the data center is pretty kind of centralizing, isn't it? And the thing with a data center is the computation doesn't happen where the user of the computation is. So you've got to build that somewhere else. So you've got to think, okay, where am I going to build my data centers? And I don't know, maybe Paul, maybe what we'll do instead of data centers is it's more distributed. Everyone's got their own machine. It doesn't have to all be in one place. We can spread it around. We can decentralize it. Okay, that will be much less efficient. Much less efficient. You'll need more machines. It will actually be less efficient in energy terms. It will produce more waste heat. As much as I hate to say it, data centers are very efficient in both senses of the term. But okay, we've got a fix for that, Paul. It's not a problem. Okay, so the energy that powers the data centers, got to get that fixed as well. And that's how energy gets around. Sadly, Tesla didn't do the whole wireless energy thing that he promised us. Maybe if he comes back, he will. But you've got to get that energy somewhere. And it's like, but this is going to be a solarpunk future, Paul. We'll just have solar panels everywhere. Windmills, maybe. It's fine. We don't need big power stations somewhere. It's like, okay, yeah, cool, fixed. So, but even so, you need to connect all those computers together because this is a network phenomenon, right? So, bandwidth as infrastructure, and it's like the internet is a very physical thing. We talk about it as this weird sort of placeless non-place, but it's like it is a solid physical thing. The way it feels is decentralized, but actually structurally it's highly centralized. What's really interesting as well is if you follow those lines, those are basically the old colonial shipping routes from the 17 and 1800s. I like really very exactly. It's a brilliant book called Sinews of War and Trade by Leila Khalili, which you should really read. But okay, we'll fix that, and we don't need cables. We'll just it'll be wireless, like 7G or whatever. I mean, great, but you're still going to have to build all those 7G towers. You're going to have to run cables to them so they've got power from wherever you're getting your power from. And we can fix that, Paul. Okay, cool. That's cool that you can fix that. But that means that, because the thing is, when you start saying, oh, great, yeah, we can do that. We can do all this spatial stuff. It's like, well, whose land are you going to do it on? Because as recent events have shown, right, when you start doing things on people's land that they don't want you to do, people start throwing explosive shit around. Right? We don't like the state. The state's a bad thing. It's like, I count myself as an anarchist too. I don't like the state, but I am not naive about what the state can do. Right? The anarchist definition of the state is it is a thing that has the monopoly on violence. And if you start fucking with states, they will use it. But okay, we'll fix that. We'll work out a way to deal with the states, Paul. It's fine. We can do that. We'll fix it. So let's just go through some of the assumptions we've made, right? So the blockchain utopia won't fail or fuck us over like every other technological utopia. A balance of freedoms will be found that cures the whole Wild West shit. The paradox of efficiency and monopoly, we'll fix that somehow. Marketizing environmental goals won't trigger the Jevons paradox. Again, maybe it's possible, I don't know. The system won't be eaten up by a sort of crypto Amazon. The big shots will stay interested when it stops making them money. You'll find a way to transact with the nation states that already exist without, in effect, becoming the thing that you're against. Because if you're a thing, if you're an entity that can interact with a state on an equal level, in all but name, you are a state. But assuming all that, oh no, it's Colombo. One last question. One last question. How do you deal with that? This is somewhere, I don't know exactly where, in Outer Mongolia. This is where rare earth metals come from. This is a big, a vast sort of square kilometers lake of radioactive sludge. The people who work there live along the edge. You can just see it in the background there. This is where rare earth metals come from. And in Sweden, where I live, up north, where the new battery factories are being built, just happens to be near some of the biggest lithium deposits on Earth, which just happen to be on the land of the Sami people, but it's fine, because the Swedes have never actually signed that whole UN thing that says they have to be nice to indigenous people, so that's probably fine. And, it would be efficient. It would be efficient to use that lithium just right there next to the battery factories. That would be fine. So look, even if you fix all those assumptions that I listed, we can't get away from this. You need to find a fix for extractivism and the fundamentally exploitative nature of supply chains, right? Because stuff has to come from somewhere to get to you, and the places that stuff comes from look like that. And when you finish with stuff, as Reece said, it's like, when stuff gets, we'll throw that away. You have to throw it away somewhere. So, both ends of the supply chain ultimately end up looking like this. That's the price of your little solarpunk utopia in the middle, right? You think of those professional shots of, Singapore's solarpunk zones, with the fancy, the trees and all the, looks great, right? You need to remember that if you turn that photo over, you see that. Every time. So, the unbearable lightness of solarpunk and blockchain. Little Prague literary reference for you there. What am I saying? How am I going to conclude this? So, first and foremost, solarpunk is not an alternative to cyberpunk. It is what cyberpunk looks like for the winners. If you actually read the cyberpunk novels that everyone quotes so often but doesn't seem to have actually paid any attention to at all, this is always implicit, right? Always implicit. The rich people live in these wonderful arcologies and space stations or enclaves where everything looks fucking great. But everyone else is like living in converted warehouses trying to hack some money out of the big company down the road. Until the supply chain is fixed, you cannot have the solar without the sludge. And a solarpunk future for the few won't last because eventually the lithium miners are going to turn up with torches and pitchforks. There's a reason why so many of the big player libertarians are preppers. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll get a job with them. Maybe you can run their network or something. You ain't going to see the sun very much living in that bunker, though. If you think technology will solve your problems, you don't understand technology and you don't understand your problems. So coders are engineers, right? And it's a powerful and transformative episteme. I was raised by engineers. It's a problem-solving discipline, fundamentally, and it has achieved amazing things. But it has been promoted over the other epistemes, and that has distorted the way the world works in incredibly dangerous ways. Engineering is brilliant at solutions, but you fucking suck at identifying the really problematic issues that matter. That's why you need the arts, that's why you need the humanities, that's why you need the social sciences, that's why you need to actually talk to people who don't spend all day on a fucking laptop. Because those people understand the qualitative and the contextual. You do not. To reiterate Reece again, there is no technological fix for social problems. We cannot innovate our way out of the cumulative consequences of our obsession with innovation. Right? It's sort of like, the house is on fire. Well, just, throw more fuel in there. That'll do it. That'll do it. Won't do it. So, can we blockchain our way to solarpunk? I'm not convinced solarpunk is buildable full stop. I think that's kind of inherent in it. Maybe. Alessandro's permaculture description yesterday was, there were some clear steps and processes there. There was an ethics there. I think there's there's an articulation there that could be followed. Maybe we could build it that way. But is blockchain the missing link? No way. Absolutely not. Many of the nice people I've spoken to have admitted that they're uncertain what it even means. We love this thing, but we're not sure what it means. We're not sure what its values are. And that's the fucking problem, right? You build first and you think later. Wrong way round. Take a tip from the Rastafari. Measure twice, cut once. Maybe blockchain will have some role to play, right? It's not going to go away. I understand that, but it's not going to fix everything either. It doesn't get to be the hero. The desire to be the hero is the problem. So if you were to ask me, I'm a person who's passionate about the blockchain. I love this stuff. I think it's important. It's what I'm great at. It's how I make my living. It's like, cool. I'm not saying stop. What I am saying is stop assuming it can fix everything. If you were to say to me, okay, well, what should I do to build a more sustainable future? To build a world that's ecologically sane? If that's what you want to do, you don't have to quit doing your blockchain stuff. But if that's what you want to do, the best thing you can do, close the laptop go outside and talk to people. Thank you.
We only have time for one quick question. Does anyone have a question? One and only one.
Love pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Okay, too much pressure for that. Great job.
Cheers.